Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to welcome you to the webinar, District Plans to Address Educational Equity, Findings from the World's Best Workforce Summary Scan. This webinar was developed in partnership with the Regional Education Lab Midwest and the Minnesota Department of Education. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. I am Dr. Dominique Bradley. I'm a researcher for the Regional Education Lab Midwest. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Dr. Raquel Gonzalez and Ms. Jennifer Hogue. Co-presenting with us today from the Minnesota Department of Education, we have Tyler Livingston, Acting Director of School Support, and Susan Burris, Program Manager and District Support Specialist. I just want to quickly go over some session logistics. Please make sure that you're muted so that we can reduce background noise. Use the chat box function to ask questions during the presentation. We will be monitoring this and responding to you as we proceed through the webinar. We will also have pause points in the presentation to respond to some of these questions. At the end of the webinar, we'll ask participants to complete a brief survey. The survey link will appear in the chat box, and you will also receive a follow-up email. A few quick notes about using the Zoom platform. If you haven't joined already, you can join the audio session via phone or computer audio. To use the audio function, hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, and a toolbar should pop up with your audio options. This toolbar is also where the chat function is. Click on the chat box, and the chat function should appear in the right-hand side of your screen. We also have live closed captioning available during this presentation. Use the toolbar to access the closed caption option as well. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the REL Midwest website after the session has closed. Our agenda for today is as follows. The Minnesota Department of Education will provide context for the webinar, a welcome, and we will review the webinar goals. We'll provide a brief review of the Regional Education Labs and REL Midwest, and my colleagues, Dr. Gonzalez and Ms. Hogue, will walk us through the World's Best Workforce Scan highlights. Then MDE will discuss next steps and reflections. We will close the session with the participant survey and the final opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to pass the baton off to Tyler Livingston from the Minnesota Department of Education.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As we get started, we wanted to do a little bit of a warm-up and a little bit of a testing our poll feature to see how that's working. We are curious who is joining us today. So you'll see displayed on your screen a poll, and if you would simply select the role that best describes you and hit submit, and we'll all have a chance to see who's present on today's webinar, at least by roles. And then we'll dive into an overview of World's Best Workforce and what this particular scan was looking for. So I'll give you a few moments to respond to the poll. And now we see displayed the results of the poll. So we're well represented from school district central office staff. Good morning to all of you. Other school administrators, principals and vice principals, teachers, educators, and members of public policy organizations as well. So good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. So we wanted to start by the big picture context of what's the topic of the day, and that is the World's Best Workforce legislation. This information might be a little bit review, but it sets a foundation for a conversation moving forward. Back in 2013, state law was passed requiring districts and charters to adopt a long-term comprehensive strategic plan supporting 5 goal areas: kindergarten readiness, read well by 3rd grade, closing the achievement gap, high school graduation rates, and graduates who are career or college ready. The strategic roadmap applying across local education authorities throughout the state is in service of Minnesota's World's Best Workforce. By building that strategic plan, the intent was to involve stakeholders in your communities to design that strategic plan and then annually report at a public meeting your progress toward meeting those world's best workforce goals. And so that's the second of 3 products is that annual report at a public meeting. The third product within World's Best Workforce is submitting to the Department of Education a summary, summarizing the annual report and the strategies you've pursued in order to meet each of those 5 goal areas. This past year, each year we refine that summary and seek to improve it in order to best provide feedback to districts and charters and to see how things are going as we all work towards the world's best workforce. This year we integrated and combined that summary report with the Achievement in Integration program progress reporting as well. As it happens, at the time of this call, you recently received feedback from MDE staff on your World's Best Workforce summaries. Our intent was to really provide at a high level some ideas and questions and wonderings, not in an evaluative sense, but more in a, as we look forward through continuous improvement, what are some things districts might think about as they continue this work. New to this work overall and into that summary report specifically was this conversation about equitable access. This was newly added to the World's Best Workforce legislation in 2016. And while that is now 3 years ago, the context of this webinar and this report, we are looking at World's Best Workforce summaries that were submitted this last December of 2018. And those summaries were based on district and charter efforts in the previous school year, 17 and 18. So as we backwards map that, really this was the first school year where the requirement to look at equitable access to effective and diverse teachers was in play. And we also wanted to take this moment and recognize that between passage of this change and that school year, MDE had not stepped into that space in providing supporting materials, guidance, resources, or other tools to help districts and charters wrestle with these concepts that can be very nuanced and challenging to undertake. So what I think we'll see in this report that follows is districts and charters doing strong efforts independently and with and among each other, but it doesn't really reflect anything that the state has necessarily led in this area. Really, this has been led at a local level. I did notice a couple questions in the chat about what if we did not receive feedback on our summary. There's in a moment in the chat, there is an email address, mde.worldsbestworkforce@state.mn.us. If you would send a note to that email address and let us know which district you are, we'll follow up with you on that feedback for your summary. So let's talk about what is meant by equitable access to teachers. Under both World's Best Workforce and the federal Every Student Succeeds Act, the definition reflects one another. That is, locally, districts must examine whether students of color, American Indian students, and low-income students have access to teachers who are experienced. And in Minnesota, we define that as having 3 years of teaching experience or more. Teachers working in their licensure field, and teachers who are considered effective. In Minnesota and through our ESSA work groups, we determined that Minnesota will use local teacher development and evaluation results. That is, teachers who are meeting standards are considered effective, or teachers who are not meeting standards are considered ineffective for the purpose of this examination. World's Best Workforce adds an element that is not in ESSA but this is a really important element. Students should have access to teachers who, quote, reflect the diversity of enrolled students. So when we use a shorthand, equitable access to diverse and effective teachers, we're reflecting that requirement under World's Best Workforce that are currently in Minnesota, the racial makeup of our teaching workforce is only 4%. 4% of our teachers in the state identify as teachers of color or American Indian teachers. Our students of color and American Indian students are closer to 33, 34%. So there's a significant representation gap in those numbers. The other piece we would like to highlight under, now not all districts and charters are under achievement and integration, but many are, and those who are, you can use those funds, the A&I funds, to reduce those disparities in equitable access to effective and diverse teachers. What we know from data nationwide and in Minnesota, so as statewide data, there are significant equity gaps, equitable access gaps. We know that as statewide numbers, schools that have a high number of low-income students compared with schools who have a low number of low-income students, there's a significant gap between the teacher effectiveness, teacher experience, teachers working in their licensure field. And the same is true for students of color and American Indian students. I think we all are aware of the research that says the #1 school-based factor on student outcomes is the effectiveness of the teacher. If that's true, and I think we should all believe that's true, it's well documented and been long documented, and if a reality, a current reality in our education system is that students of color, American Indian students, and low-income students have less access to teachers who are experienced, effective, working in their licensure field, that's likely a root cause. One of many, but that is likely a significant root cause to how students are doing in our school system. It's a systemic inequity. In Minnesota, when we worked with Voices for Racial Justice in defining what we mean by educational equity, and we used this as a centerpiece of our SS stakeholder engagement, the definition that's appearing on the screen with a little colored highlights is what we used in defining what educational equity. The current reality is that not all students have access to effective teachers. And there are conditions that come from our history, come from our past, that contribute to that inequitable access. And in order to fix that, significant things need to change. Structural and institutional barriers, we need to change those in order to provide more equitable access. Now, this is pretty heady stuff, and we do plan throughout this presentation, and particularly at the end, to draw this down into local and specific examples. I'm noticing the questions, great questions in the chat about what does this look like in a rural community, 95% white, et cetera. We'll draw down to those examples as we go through the presentation today. And I think the thing I'd like to center us in this examination of what's happening in the state and at a local level is children need to the best we can, we need to work to support all of our educators to be their best selves. And we need to be sure that the children who need our best educators have access to them. However you define, and I'm using air quotes around best, that is something that we as the adults in this system need to provide for. I'm just about done, but I failed to mention the research around teachers of color, which is newer than the effective teachers having an impact on students. Relatively newer to that is that having students having access to educators of color or American Indian educators. That benefits all students of all races. And there is an added benefit for students of color and American Indian students to have been taught in their education careers by a teacher of color, an American Indian teacher. While we wrestle with a reality that 4% of our teaching workforce, can't be in every place at every time, we need to move that number up in the state of Minnesota. And so that's probably a statewide challenge and opportunity for us. And we think there are methods locally that can be pursued in any system, including that example system that I mentioned earlier, that what if our student population is predominantly white, that you might be meeting the letter of the law by having teachers who reflect the diversity of the enrolled students, at least racial diversity of the enrolled students, and those primarily white student body would also benefit from having a teacher of color. Again, these are long-term strategies, long-term problems that have taken a history of American society and American education system to unravel and dismantle these systems that are in front of us today. So we wanted to center this particular World's Best Workforce review, looked at not all 5 goal areas plus equitable access. We really focused this review, or we asked Rel Midwest to focus this review on equitable access to teachers, as well as, so that's where we'll start, as well as efforts to close the achievement gap. So with that, I will transition to Jennifer, I believe.
Dominique, actually.
Dominique.
Okay. So I just want to say that we are recording all the questions that are coming into the chat box. We will address them later, so please keep them coming in. We'll make sure to take a moment to answer those questions as we have our pause points. For our webinar goals today, as Tyler had stated before, and thank you, Tyler, for providing all that great context for us. The goals of the webinar today are to provide an overview of the World's Best Workforce District summaries as they relate to equity issues, as Tyler had said, and also to highlight some of these unique approaches that districts have taken in developing and executing their equity plans. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of who the Regional Education Lab and who Rel Midwest are. Rel Midwest is one of 10 other regional education laboratories funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. The type of support that Rel Midwest offers, we offer this kind of support to state and district level education stakeholders. We offer training and coaching, research resources. We conduct applied research projects with our partners. We work to disseminate research to a wide variety of stakeholders. We also have a resource called Ask a Rel, which I would encourage everyone to check out. Ask a Rel provides summaries of existing research on a wide range of topics and questions. You can find that on our Rel Midwest website, which we'll post in the chat box in just a moment. The work of these partnerships is developed in consultation with the state education agencies and district staff to address priority education issues in the region. Rel Midwest serves all the states in the Midwest. We conduct our work through collaborative research partnerships with district and state level stakeholders. Each partnership in each state develops their work around different focal areas. In Minnesota, we focus on career and college readiness through the Midwest Career Readiness Research Alliance, or MCRA, which is who supports this webinar today. In Wisconsin, our partnership focuses on the Black-White achievement gap. In Illinois, we focus on early childhood education. In Michigan, we focus on improving teacher preparation. And in Iowa, we have a partnership that focuses on improving the use of technology in classroom instruction. If you'd like any more information about the work of any of these partnerships or the work of MCRA, please visit the Rel Midwest website or email me directly, and I will put that information in the chat box for you. Okay. Now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Gonzalez.
Actually, Jennifer Hogue here. Thanks, Dominique. Next, we're going to provide highlights from our review of the 2017 to 2018 school district summaries. So some of you may have attended our webinar or one of our in-person trainings last year, and that was to provide an overview of our findings from a scan of the 2015 to 2016 summaries. And as you may recall, that review synthesized district practices across all 5 of the goal areas in the reports. And as Tyler mentioned, during that first scan and throughout the trainings, districts described their challenges in addressing goals for closing student achievement gaps and also for attracting diverse and highly qualified teachers. So as a result, MDE leaders identified equity as a primary focus area in providing support to districts and requested that our scan this year focus in these areas. So specifically, we focused on the following 4 areas of the World's Best Workforce summaries related to equity. And our presentation today will cover all 4 of these areas. So first, equitable access to experienced, effective, and in-field teachers, access to diverse teachers, public reporting of teacher equity data, and closing student achievement gaps. A little more about the scan process itself. So we selected a random sample of 200 district summaries. And our team then reviewed, organized, and entered the district summaries into a qualitative data software. And we coded the district content to identify different patterns and themes. We also ensured that our sample of 200 districts was representative of the different types of districts in Minnesota based on the following characteristics: service cooperative region, district type, district enrollment size, the percent of students qualifying for free and reduced price lunch, the percent of students receiving special education services, and the racial and ethnic diversity of the student body. Before handing it over to Raquel to dig into the findings, I just wanted to acknowledge that there are a few limitations to keep in mind with this analysis. So first, the district summaries varied a lot in the amount of information and the level of detail that they provided. So there were some instances in which districts dove into more detail and others was really high level. There were also a few instances in which the question might have been misinterpreted and districts might have given a different response if they had a more thorough understanding of what MDE was asking. And then second, this analysis really only captures what was reported in the district summaries. So it's entirely possible and probable that districts are implementing other strategies and practices that simply weren't reported in the summaries. So with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Raquel.
Good morning, everyone. So again, I'm Raquel Gonzalez, and I'm a senior associate here at Social Policy Research Associates and a member of the Rural Midwest team. And I'm going to kick off our discussion of the finding by beginning with focus area 1, equitable access to experienced, effective, and in-field teachers. I do see a question in the chat box if we made, it would be interesting to see comparisons between charter and traditional schools. So we did do comparisons across those different areas that we stratified, and we did see some differences by district size. I think there were some by charter and traditional. We don't go into a lot of detail about those differences here, just because there's a lot to cover. But in our memo with the highlights, we do discuss some of that. Okay, so this first slide here shows the questions that districts were asked to report in this focus area in the summer reports. And districts were asked to answer the following 5 questions. So who is included in the conversations to review equitable access data, and when did those conversations occur? What gaps, if any, were identified? What data were used to identify the gaps? What were the root causes that contributed to the gaps in access? and what strategies were districts using to address these gaps? For the first question, who was included in the conversations to review equitable access data, and when did the conversations occur? Districts reported on 4 types of participants who participated in these conversations, and they were school staff, who were the most common type of participant reported, followed by district staff, then school board members, and parents and community members. So I'm going to go in more detail here, but before I discuss the graph, I want to quickly point out a few key things, and some of this is reiterating some points that Jennifer made. So not all respondents answered all items. So for this item, of 136 of the 200 districts whose summary we reviewed, or in other words, 2/3 of the sample districts reported who in their district were involved in conversations to ensure low-income students, students of color, and American Indian students are taught by experienced in-field teachers. And you'll see in the title, the N equals 136. And so that refers to how many districts responded. So you'll see this throughout all our graphs. When you see that number, that tells you how many districts responded. For this question also, districts reported that various types of respondents were involved in these conversations, with districts often reporting multiple respondent types participating in these conversations. So you'll see that the numbers won't add up to 100, right? They're not mutually exclusive. So a district may have reported that school staff and district staff responded to this item. So you'll see this also, this pattern is true for many of the graphs displayed in this presentation, right? That they won't add up to 100. So now that we've gone over some of these basics, let's discuss the findings a little bit more. So who was involved? So overwhelmingly, we see the school administrators are involved, with 70% of districts responded to this question, reporting that school administrators were involved in these conversations. 26 reported that teachers were involved, and 10% reported that other school staff, such as guidance counselors or resource teachers, were involved. We see that 58% of districts responded reported that district staff were involved, and district staff who were involved often included human resources directors and other HR staff, various committees such as hiring committees and placement teams, superintendents, and directors of teaching and learning. We also see 24% of districts had school board members participate, and 10% of districts had parents and community members participate. We also see some differences by district size. So larger districts were more likely than other smaller districts to have district staff participate in these conversations. In contrast, smaller districts appeared more likely to have school board members participate in these conversations. And this question also captured data on when these conversations occurred. So while most districts did not provide information on when they occurred, for the 84 districts that did, about half of them reported these conversations happening annually. The second question in this focus area asks, what gaps did districts find related to equitable access to experienced, effective, and in-field teachers? And 68% of districts did not find any gaps. So here, again, here's a little bit more detail. So as I noted, 68% of districts did not find any gaps, and some recent districts reported no gaps in equitable access to experienced, effective, and in-field teachers was due to size. So for example, smaller districts often reported that they only have 1 teacher per grade, so they would not have an equitable access as everyone has access to the same teachers. We see that 19% of districts reported they had identified gaps, and this was often due to teacher turnover, the teacher shortage, and also several districts reported on gaps in having experienced special education teachers. And then 13% of districts appear to have misinterpreted the question. Some of these districts reported on gaps related to equitable access to diverse teachers, which is asked later in the summary, versus responding directly to this question, which asks about gaps in equitable access to experienced, effective, and in-field teachers. And other districts responded to this question by discussing the student achievement gap. The next question in this focus area asks what data were used to identify gaps in access. And districts predominantly use teacher data as at least one of their data sources. And teacher data included the number of teachers who were licensed, the percent of teachers in a district who were in field, and the number of teachers who had more than 3 years of experience. In other words, who were experienced teachers by MDE's definition. Some districts also reported using both teacher and student data, and in a smaller set of cases, only student data. Sorry, and I just want to go back to a question. So we're just going to, give me a second. So the question asked about whether we verified the 68% no gaps. So we just looked at what was reported in the summary. So if districts responded that there was no gaps, we took that to be true, but there, this process did not include a verification. Okay, so again, here we go into a little bit more detail about the data used to identify gaps. And in this figure, we present the most common data districts reported they used to identify gaps in access to in-field experienced effective teachers. The dark blue bars represent teacher data, and the lighter blue represents student data used by districts. Districts reported 3 main types of teacher data they used: in-field status, used by 42% of districts; teacher evaluations, again used by 42% of districts; and teacher qualifications, used by 22% of districts. Primary student data reported being used by districts, including student demographics and MCA data. And to a smaller extent, districts also reported other student data were used, such as student graduation rates and attendance. Some districts use both teacher and student data to identify gaps in access to excellent teachers. For example, one district reported in a summary on the percent of teachers that were defined as inexperienced and out of field. The district then compared the number of low-income and minority students versus their peers being taught by inexperienced or out-of-field teachers, and the district found that there was not any significant differences in teacher assignments across these groups of students. So we wanted to be as interactive as we could for a webinar that has 200 people. So we have a few pause points that we have structured. So we'd like to take here our first pause point and ask, what have you found surprising so far? So feel free to share in the chat, and we'll just take a few minutes to let folks reflect and chat. Okay, we'll give it another 15 seconds to see if there's any participants who want to reflect on what they have found surprising so far.
Just to start to respond to a few of the comments, thank you for adding your reactions. So there was one comment about verification of what is being reported versus what might actually be happening. So our scan is really, the objective was to provide an overview of what districts, kind of like how districts say that they're fulfilling the goals of World's Best Workforce. And so it would be kind of a separate study to say, what is actually happening. But in our work with MDE, I think the value is in how districts are thinking about this work and how they're sort of thinking about approaching closing these gaps. And then in terms of the gaps that were discussed, that was gaps in access to effective in-field and experienced teachers. Let's see, we got some.
There's another question about the sample. If there were more than 200 districts, why did we take a random sample? And that's just within the time frame that we had to do this work. That was just a way to kind of help manage the work. So there's often kind of a smaller sample, but we try to be representative and random, and so we feel fairly confident that what we're finding here would be true across the entire population of districts.
And I'll respond to one question as well. A comment about, you know, if one site identifies, hires teachers of color, develops them, what's to stop them from moving to another school system, particularly if that other school system is able to offer more incentives, such as a higher pay rate. And that, you know, that comment really names one of many challenges in this work, and root causes that are at play that we need to be thinking about. You know, what is it that draws people away from certain communities and to other communities? What is it that is drawing potential educators of color to the profession or away from the profession? So there's a lot at play there. So I don't have a specific answer to that comment, other than to say that is one of the realities that we are facing, along with a teacher shortage, as one comment pointed out, along with we don't have enough teachers of color in the workforce, period. So, thank you.
Okay, so we'll continue along, and thank you everyone for participating in the chat. So, and we have a few more of these as we go along. So districts were also asked what were the root causes identified as contributing to gaps in access, and districts discussed challenges with recruitment and retention of teachers as root causes to gaps in access. So 3 of the primary root causes identified by the districts were the teacher shortage that was noted both as a problem in Minnesota and nationally, teacher turnover, a lack of a competitive salary to either recruit or retain teachers. So I think we've seen that in the chat. 5% of districts discuss teacher effectiveness as measured by teacher evaluations as one of the root causes. And 23% of districts also misinterpreted the item and either discussed gaps in access to diverse teachers. And again, that is a question, but that's in a separate section. Here we're talking about gaps in access to effective teachers. Some districts also discuss student-related challenges such as poverty or limited English language proficiency as a root cause to gaps in equitable access. When asked to report on strategies to improve access to effective and in-field teachers, districts discussed 3 main strategies. The first strategy, supporting teachers, was aimed at improving the effectiveness for districts' current teachers through, for example, professional learning communities. The second strategy was focused on improving the recruitment of teachers into the district. These strategies appear to be efforts to identify and recruit effective and in-field teachers. For the third strategy, districts discussed practices to support intentional placement of students with experience and effective teachers. So in supporting teachers, some of the strategies identified by districts included professional development. So we heard that from 39% of districts. So this might be, again, professional learning communities or professional development on culturally responsive teaching. Mentoring support discussed by 20% of districts. Teacher evaluation and improvement plans discussed by 16%. Coaching discussed by 10%, and supporting instructional rigor discussed by 4%, for example, through the use of technology. Strategies to improve recruitment included working with teacher preparation programs at colleges and universities to recruit candidates, encouraging paraprofessionals to get licensed, and providing signing bonuses and more competitive salaries. When reporting on assigning teachers, districts discuss the development of protocols or scoring systems to score teachers to help determine what students they should teach. And I'll give you an example of this in the next slide. Districts also reported other simple metrics like ensuring that no grade level has more than one inexperienced teacher when creating assignments. And lastly, we see that 16% of districts misinterpreted the question. And in these instances, districts describe supports provided to students, such as having after-school programming, providing access to mental health support, and providing college tours. And while these are all important support for students, they are not a strategy to improve access to effective in-field teachers, but are broad strategies to support access to resources for students. So as I mentioned, here's a sample practice one district used to assign teachers. So this district reported using an index system to help place teachers and students. So teachers were assigned a score based on years of teaching experience, years teaching at the district, type of license, and the teacher's overall performance score. And the combined scores of all teachers were average, which created a mean quality index score and a standard deviation. So if you see here in this normal bell curve, the standard deviation helps provide a range to understand the quality index score. So any index score that is within one standard deviation of the mean is still considered an acceptable quality index score. We would imagine that teachers that have above one standard deviation, so those that are in the tail end, the higher end of this bell curve, are more effective teachers. And again, we would imagine that teachers in the lower end, so that's the orange or red, the teacher B area, would need additional support to be effective. So for this district, every teacher received, as I noted, a quality index score, and the quality index score was then examined based on student characteristics. And any student whose teacher index score fell below one standard deviation of the mean was flagged. And if this was a student identified in a target group, the student was then reassigned to a teacher with a teacher quality index score within the average or above average range. So that is, if a teacher went to TB, but this is a student, sorry, if a student was assigned to teacher B and this is a student flagged as a target group, then they would get reassigned to teacher A, who falls within the mean teacher quality index score. And we highlight this as a sample practice just to show some of the practice your peers are doing to ensure equitable access to effective in-field and experienced teachers. Okay, so here's another pause point, and this is a poll that we're going to share. That should be popping up soon. Okay. So which of these strategies to improve access to excellent teachers would you like your district to focus on more? So supporting teachers, improving recruitment, or assigning teachers? So we see that, 59% of all of you thought that supporting teachers was a good way to improve access to excellent teachers. 29% discussed improving recruitment, and 12% assigning teachers. Okay. So we'll close this and move on. So the world's best workforce legislation requires that districts have strategies to increase equitable access to effective and diverse teachers. And so next we're going to focus the discussion on access to diverse teachers. So again, this slide displays what districts were asked to report in this focus area. Districts were asked to answer the following two questions. What has the district discovered regarding student access to teachers reflect the diversity of students enrolled in the districts? and what efforts are in place to increase the diversity of the teachers in the district. So districts were asked to report on discoveries regarding student access to diverse teachers. So for our analysis, we classified the discoveries into challenges and successes. However, few districts actually discussed successes and challenges in recruiting and supporting diverse teachers. Only 35% of districts reported any successes, while 41% reported challenges. When asked to describe successes regarding increased equitable access to effective and diverse teachers, 29 districts emphasized that their teachers do represent the demographics of their student body. And in many of these cases, districts reported that their students are predominantly white, as is their teaching workforce, implying that there is no problem with equitable access to diverse teachers. 27 districts that responded to this item interpreted the question more broadly and discussed how they have been able to leverage diverse staff from other non-teaching positions, including paraprofessionals, administrative assistants, secretarial support staff, racially diverse liaisons, for example, a cultural liaison, American Indian liaison, and in some cases, even principals who reflect the diversity of students. And finally, 21 districts reported that hiring practices had helped them secure a diverse teaching workforce, and often not a lot of detail was provided, but some districts did describe efforts to recruit in new areas. So I just want to go back. I see a comment about using a bell curve to rate teachers. So we were just using the bell curve as an example of how you would use a quality index score and one standard deviation above or below. But to how the district implemented it and what do they do with the bottom third, you know, we don't have that detail, but I think it's definitely a question considering.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so that district is looking at the distribution of its current teaching workforce and then reassigning students in their priority group. So it's unclear what the priority student is, but like if that district is focusing on closing racial achievement gaps, they would ensure just that students of that racial or ethnic background are not assigned to the lowest quality teachers.
Somebody wants to share the next slide again.
Well, I think, just to move forward, we won't have a chance to go back to the index slide, but you'll be able to see it in the PowerPoint.
Yeah, we'll be sharing the PowerPoint after the presentation.
Okay. So here is an example of a sample of a targeted hiring practice. So one small diverse charter school district reported how they made a serious effort over the last 2 years to increase the number of instructional staff, particularly classroom teachers who were people of color. So they began by securing a grant from Minnesota Come Back, a nonprofit coalition supporting districts in Minnesota to fund teacher recruitment efforts. And these efforts included hiring a recruiting service that advertised their positions to a wide variety of teacher preparation programs that focus on teachers of color. And their results, so some of this, the recruiting service, for example, would recruit at historically Black colleges and universities and tribal colleges and universities. And so these efforts were successful. This charter district's percentage of classroom teachers of color grew from 14% in the 2017-18 school year to 40% in the 2018-19 school year. About 40% of districts reported on challenges with student access to diverse teachers. Of these 82 districts, the most common challenge districts reported was the lack of racially and ethnically diverse teacher applicants. And this challenge appeared to be further compounded in rural districts that struggle with access to a limited workforce and a non-diverse workforce. And I think we've been seeing this kind of theme come up in the chat as well. The number of limited applicants represented an important challenge for about a quarter of the districts who reported on challenges. And again, both of these were further compounded in rural locations. Lastly, a few districts noted that the lack of competitive salary made it difficult to recruit and attract teachers generally. So here's another pause point. Again, how did findings on successes and challenges in recruiting and supporting diverse teachers resonate with your experience? And again, we'll give a couple of minutes for respondents to write in the chat box.
Hello, everyone. This is Tyler. If you or the REL team is still talking, we can't hear you. But I am seeing a pause point and a reflection question there. If you would mind sharing, does this last part of the presentation, in what ways does that resonate with your local experience or not resonate with your experience? And as a reminder, if you would like for your comment to be displayed for all to see, almost like a Twitter chat, you will need to change the to line to all panelists and attendees for everyone to see. Otherwise, of course, only the panelists will be able to see.
Okay, well, we'll keep moving along, but I think if everyone's, this chat box is really interesting, but, and it seems like a lot what we have shared so far has resonated with a lot of participants. So districts also reported on strategies to diversify their teaching workforce and ensure their workforce represents Minnesota's rich racial and ethnic diversity. And most of the strategies focus on improving recruiting and hiring. So the most common strategy was to develop targeted recruitment strategies by partnering with colleges to develop a recruitment pipeline and by posting job announcements throughout the state and across state lines. 36% of districts also explained that they were improving their hiring practices to more intentionally prioritize diversity when it comes time to hire. 25% of districts describe using a grow your own approach by investing in teacher residency programs to develop new teachers, including racially and ethnically diverse teachers. Some districts used MDE's Grow Your Own grant, but some also reported on these approaches without specifically mentioning these funds. So for example, encouraging paraprofessionals that may more closely represent the student population to continue and get certified. 11% of districts reported that they are trying to create the conditions that would attract and retain diverse teachers and staff. So these efforts included mentorship opportunities for diverse staff, the addition of culturally relevant coursework, professional development of culturally relevant teaching, and the use of an equity lens in teachers' daily practice. And lastly, 5% of districts reported undertaking specific efforts to understand the problem in hiring diverse staff. And in the next few slides, we'll share some language directly from the district reports to further illuminate on these strategies. So here's an example of a strategy to improve the hiring practice. So one district implemented a new recruitment and hiring guide for supervisors that includes a case for racial diversity and the need to recruit and select more staff of color. And it also discussed the role of the HR department in overseeing the process to increase diversity, monitoring results, and having conversations with hiring managers. Districts also talked about focusing on diversity and inclusion in the culture of work. So one district formed affinity groups to support diverse staff in their system and worked with diverse staff to learn from their experiences about positives and areas for improvement in the district. And as noted, some districts were working on assessing the problem and understanding it better. So one district noted that they're in the process of doing a comprehensive needs assessment where they're going to examine teacher placement at all of their buildings and look more closely at the teacher demographics in schools that are most diverse. So we have another pause point poll here. So which of these strategies to diverse the teaching workforce do you find most compelling for your district? So develop targeted recruitment strategies, improve hiring practices, use a grow your own approach, focus on diversity and inclusion in the culture of work, or conduct a needs assessment. Okay, and so the develop the targeted recruitment strategy, the use your grow your own approach seems to be the most compelling for the participants today, but focusing on diversity and inclusion in the culture of work as well as developing targeted recruitment strategies. Okay, so well. The world's best workforce legislation requires districts to publicly report data related to equitable teacher distribution. So again, here's the language from the summary report. So districts were asked to kind of check this box indicating whether or not they publicly report data related to equitable teacher distribution, including data on access to effective, experienced, and in-field teachers for low-income students, students of color, and American Indian students. And we found that 71% of districts, or 141 of the 200 districts reviewed, publicly share teacher equity data. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and she's going to review some of the other findings from this work.
Great, thanks, Raquel. So the three focus areas that Dr. Gonzalez focused on were focused on teachers, and this final focus area is based on our findings on how districts are working toward closing student achievement gaps. So on this slide, you'll see an actual excerpt of the World's Best Workforce Summary Report, where districts were asked to establish a goal around closing the student achievement gap between student groups for the 2017 to 2018 school year, and then report on the result tied to that goal. Districts were also asked to provide a brief narrative answering the following questions. What data have you used to identify needs in this goal area, and how is this data disaggregated by student groups? What strategies are in place to support this goal area? How well are you implementing your strategies? And how do you know whether it is or is not helping you make progress toward your goal? Districts varied in which student groups they targeted for closing achievement gaps and how they reported their goals. So the most common gaps that districts created goals for were income-based, followed by race and ethnicity, special education, and English learner students. So again, the most common achievement gap identified among those who responded was between free and reduced price lunch students and non-free and reduced price lunch students. So we see here that 52% of districts created goals to close this particular student achievement gap. 42% of responding districts identified goals for racial or ethnic student groups. As shown in the smaller bar graph above, the most common racial and ethnic student group of focus was American Indian students, followed by African American, Hispanic, and white. 8 districts created goals for students of color as a single group, and 5 districts focused on racial achievement gaps and created goals for each of the listed groups above. Districts who reported goals for these race and ethnic student groups tended to focus more on English language arts and reading goals than math or other subjects, as an aside. There we go. 29% of districts created goals for closing achievement gaps between special education students and non-special education students. A smaller group, about 10% of responding districts, identified goals to close the achievement gap for English learners. And 9% of districts that responded created goals for every single one of these student groups listed. So free and reduced price lunch, every single racial or ethnic category, special education, and English learners. And that leaves 21% of districts whose goals were to improve achievement for all students without separate goals for student groups. So just to dig into this a little more, this means that 79% of districts identified specific goals for student groups to close achievement gaps, while the other 21% of responding districts reported goals for improving outcomes for all students without mention of specific student groups. So some of these districts in this 21% explained that because most of their students are classified as non-white, receiving free and reduced price lunch, special education, or English learners, these kind of like priority groups, that improving outcomes for all of their students would make progress towards closing the broader achievement gap statewide. And other districts explained that their student body was just too homogeneous or too small to make goals for specific student groups. In addition to focusing on different groups of students, districts framed their approach to closing the achievement gap in a few different ways. So growth in the percentage proficient for a group, shrinking the gap between two groups, or exceeding or catching up to a statewide average. So I'll give some examples of those different framings. Here we have an example of a goal that is framed as growth in percentage proficient within a particular student group. So this district said, increase the percent of special education students tested who are proficient as measured by the MCA3 reading assessment in May to 20%. So they're focusing on just growing the percent proficient within that group of special education students. This goal is an example of shrinking the gap in the percent proficient between a student group and a higher achieving student group. So this example is the achievement gap between white students and American Indian students in grades 3 through 8 and 11 on all state accountability tests for math will decrease from 27.3% in 2017 to 24.57% in 2018. So that one is really focusing on comparing one student group to another student group and shrinking that gap. And lastly, some districts focused on closing the achievement gap by exceeding or catching up to the statewide average. So an example of this goal is the school's ELL proficiency rate is greater than 10 percentage points above the state average in math, reading, and science as measured by the MCA by 2021. Again, let's take a break here and ask the group, how does your district frame its achievement gap goals? So we have one of these three options that we discussed, or other, if your district frames it in some other way. Okay, so it looks like most of you, or 45% of you, said that your district frames your student achievement gap goals in terms of the growth in percent proficient within a particular student group. And then the next most popular is shrinking the gap between a student group and a higher achieving student group. Okay, thank you. So next, we looked at the question of what subjects or content areas are districts focusing on for achievement gap-related goals. And districts reported largely focusing on closing the achievement gap in reading. 90% of districts are focusing on ELA or reading, or math with 76% of districts. And a few also created goals for science or other areas. The majority of responding districts, about 85%, reported using the MCA either alone or in combination with other tools to identify achievement gaps. So other common assessments that districts are using are the NWEA MAP, STAR, Fast Bridge Learning, and the ACT. A few districts also used non-assessment data like attendance, student grades, and graduation rates. In addition to asking districts to identify specific goals for closing achievement gaps, the template asks that districts specify how they disaggregate their data to identify needs in this goal area. And most districts disaggregate by all or some student groups. So I'll explain a little bit more what that means. So 53% of districts explain that they disaggregate data by some, but not all of the student groups. So for example, if you go to the next slide, this district reported, we disaggregate data by using the student groups designated by the state: free and reduced price lunch, non-free and reduced price lunch students, and special education. These are the only groups large enough for us to consider. So again, this is an example of a district that disaggregates by some, but not all student groups. So 35% of districts explain that they disaggregate by all of the student groups, and then 6% of districts reported disaggregating by proficiency levels rather than by student groups. 6% of responses were unclear and couldn't be categorized, and 4% of districts reported that they do not disaggregate student data at all because their student population is largely homogeneous or their student population is too small. And then I see we have a question on if you're allowed to use something beside the MCAs for the purpose of the World's Best Workforce report. Tyler, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, yeah, it's encouraged to use MCAs in combination with other measures or other measures if that makes more sense for your district.
Yes, districts and charters are free to use what measures make the most sense for them. Of course, with MCAs having other roles in our education system, and that should be among the measures that are used. This is meant to be a local strategic plan with the flexibility to have measures that make the most sense for your communities.
Okay. So districts were also asked to describe their strategies for supporting their achievement gap goals, and nearly 3/4 of districts listed more than one strategy that they're using to make progress towards closing student achievement gaps. So this graph provides an overview of the different types of strategies that districts reported using to close achievement gaps. So from most common to least, these strategies include improving core instruction, intervention for struggling students, targeted supports for specific populations, data-driven instruction, professional development and teacher effectiveness, social emotional learning supports, and culturally responsive practices. And then there were some strategies that didn't fit neatly into any of these categories, such as expanding gifted and talented services or IB programs. So I'm going to give an example of each of these types of strategies that we found. So here we have an example of a district working on improving core instruction to close student achievement gaps. The school has purchased an updated version of our math curriculum, the Investigations, that provides better resources for both students and teachers. The new version will be implemented during the 2018 to 2019 school year. So these types of strategies were meant to improve classroom learning for all students. 52% of districts are implementing interventions or additional supports for struggling students, including this district that reported, for our middle school and high school students, there is an alternative learning center, which allows students to access a highly qualified teacher to provide aid on academic areas of weakness. Classroom interventions are also made based on individual needs of students struggling academically through our MTSS program. This quote shows what one district is doing to target their strategy to a specific population identified in their goal. As a result of the increase in the proficiency gap, the district has convened a special education instructional task force to examine its model for delivery of service and identified research-based interventions. 40% of responding districts reported focusing on student data as a key strategy to close the achievement gap, including this district here. So data-driven assessments in both reading and math are administered to students in grades 2 through 8, a minimum of 4 times throughout the school year. After these assessments are administered, data results meetings are held with the teachers and the academic director. At these meetings, it is determined whether various concepts need to be retaught, which students may need remediation, and which students may need more challenging material. About 1/3 of districts identified professional development and other teacher supports as strategies to close the achievement gap. So one such district said that we provide professional development for teacher leadership teams on analyzing all types of student data as part of a comprehensive needs assessment, and secondary tier 2 and special education teachers in the area of effective reading assessment and instruction for struggling adolescent readers. Lastly, about 1/4 described strategies related to enhancing social emotional learning and positive, culturally inclusive learning environments. This example district reported 2 such strategies, including elevating student voice and having staff in grade level and content area teams review lessons through the lens of cultural relevance. And again, this is a good place for us to pause here and ask the group, which of these specific strategies seems to you or strikes you as particularly promising at closing student achievement gaps? Okay, it looks like the most common answer is that improving core instruction is the most promising practice at closing student achievement gaps, followed by data-driven instruction and intervention for struggling students. Okay. Okay, and lastly, districts were asked to describe how they're assessing progress towards their goals to close student achievement gaps. And districts that assessed this in their summary primarily relied on summative student assessment data, such as the MCA. In addition, 43% of districts reported using formative student assessment data to track their progress, and 10% of districts cited non-academic student outcomes data, such as attendance, credit accumulation, graduation, and behavior-related data. And 6% of districts are monitoring the fidelity of their strategy implementation through things like classroom observations and systematic reviews of programs and interventions. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Tyler to discuss next steps.
Thank you, REL Midwest team. I was really pleased to see such a vigorous chat during this presentation. I tried to stay active in the chat, but I wasn't able to respond to everyone. And this doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. And that's largely what I'm getting to in these next steps and reflections here. We also had a chance internally at MDE to interact with this report and have conversations about this. And there are a lot of themes we gleaned from looking at this report. I'll name two, and a lot of things you also named in the chat and in your conversations. One theme is we have a number of districts and charters that are offering some great starting points, some great examples of their work and how they're engaging with this critical question. Whether it's through grow your own practices or hiring practices, or thinking about how they assign teachers within their system, in large systems and small systems, and I could go on, but there are really some assets that we can build on and elevate and lift up and share with folks, which also would lead to my second theme is there are probably many ways to interpret the lack of responses for many of the questions in the equitable access section. And I choose to think some of the lack of responses is because this is a new question that we're asking ourselves. And we could use some examples. So what would this look like in a rural, homogeneous, small community versus a small charter school in the Twin Cities versus a mid-size or a large urban or suburban district? You know, the answers to those questions are wide and varied, and I think folks could use some examples of, you know, how would we answer this question, and what are the kinds of activities we could do? And so I think it's also exploring this concept more. And then part of what's limiting is looking at district level inequities, because oftentimes the greatest inequities in access, and again, I'm talking about access to teachers. There are other inequities in our education system to be sure, but for today's conversation, it's access to teachers. You know, some of those inequities are greatest in classroom by classroom. I'm sure we all could tell a story of new teachers who are assigned 4 or 5 different preps. They don't get a classroom, so they operate on a cart. And oftentimes those preps are working with freshmen who also you know, experience some challenges as they work their way into high school, or maybe even students who are in a remedial 9th grade English course, for example. I don't know that that's the right assignment decision, to be perfectly honest, for students who might need a consistent presence. Even if that teacher's a dynamo, that's a lot to put on a brand new teacher. That's just one example. So, and as an example of a classroom practice that might be commonplace in systems that needs to be re-examined and looked at for its implications, particularly for students of color, American Indian students, and low-income students. So next steps for MDE. A lot of the chat, you know, what is the state thinking about and looking at in this work? 2 broad things are spoken about here. One is we are currently working with dozens of professional organizations, so groups like Education Minnesota, E4E, the Secondary and Elementary Principals Associations, and so forth. So that's what I mean by professional organizations. We're working with several advocacy groups. We are such as the Coalition to Increase Teachers of Color and American Indian Teachers, as well as their many partners. We are working with state racial and ethnic councils. And through all this stakeholder engagement, right now we're in kind of a one-on-one phase of building relationships with these groups and talking about what this initiative is, with the invitation to participate with us, or for us to come alongside and participate with them, because there are many groups that have been active in the space long before MDE. One of our commitments is, starting late summer into this fall, is to update Minnesota's plan for equitable access to diverse and effective teachers. We have a plan. It was published in 2015, and it's time really to work with stakeholders to look at our updated data, to do some root cause analyses along with stakeholders. And a number of things you mentioned in the chat will certainly emerge from those root cause analyses. And so what strategies can we pursue at a state level? Because as many people pointed out in their summaries, we have a teacher shortage in Minnesota. That's a problem that can't necessarily be solved one district or charter at a time. That's a statewide issue. We have an issue in the lack of diversity in our teacher workforce. So we need to increase the teacher workforce. We need to diversify the teacher workforce. And we also need to retain the educators we have. Because we also know that teachers are leaving the profession. And we also know that teachers of color are leaving the profession at higher rates than their white colleagues. These are significant challenges. And MDE is not alone in working on this. And it's going to take a lot of people working very, very hard and challenging one another to make an impact in these spaces. So we are going to try to do the work at a state level to work on those state barriers and drivers that are existing. The other piece we're trying to do, and this is all big work, is to provide support for all of you in districts and charters to help you with your local equitable access efforts. So state efforts and local efforts working side by side. This is one of the reasons why, when you did receive your World's Best Workforce Summary feedback, we didn't offer, we offered the same comment to everyone, actually. And all that was simply pointing to some resources that we very recently developed after your school year 17-18, so you didn't have access to these things. And coming in the future, we know we need to raise the awareness about this initiative and provide some common communications. We'd like to establish some networks and communities of practice of local leaders who are working on this initiative, helping to elevate some of those gems and those assets that already exist. Because we know that if the superintendent down the road is doing something that they're seeing that is really positive, and they'd be happy to share that with other superintendents and education leaders in other systems, so that good practice can multiply. So that's very broadly what we are seeking to do as a result of knowing what our data is telling us. And the summary reports, it just further energized us and motivated us that we can provide a better role in talking about this work and convening people to discuss this and to provide some ideas and suggestions. We will never pretend that we know answers to all of these questions, but we can certainly convene people to think about it and do a huge lift in terms of looking at the research and things like that. So in the next slide, and looking at limited time, we would invite any additional comments, questions that you have for us in particular. You could either put that in the chat. We'll have a record of the chat and do what we can to follow up with individuals who participate in the chat. But you could also email me. You'll see my email at the end of this presentation. It's my first name dot last name at state.mn.us. And again, my name is Tyler Livingston. We did receive some questions when you registered, and many of them were addressed throughout the chat here. A lot of questions about, what would this look like in a rural school? How do we even demonstrate our efforts to equitable access? How do we meet this requirement? And one way to meet this requirement, again, I think there are dozens, is to begin looking at which students have access to which teachers. And of our teacher workforce, whether you're doing a formal evaluation results or even some informal ones, you know, is this teacher best positioned to teach this particular assignment? Or how do we incentivize some of our all-star teachers, maybe even our board-certified teachers, to consider taking an assignment that might be a little bit new for them, but also offer a different challenge and would allow them to thrive in that space as well. So lots of kinds of questions like that. I know that's an insufficient answer for an end of a webinar, but I look forward to engaging it in just those kinds of conversations about what this might look like in various contexts. There was a question about enforcement of this requirement and who enforces it. This is a locally enforced initiative. We think your communities should be a part of this conversation, and we think communities would be a part of both supporting districts and charters to do this work, as well as holding districts and charters accountable for this work. We don't have tight mechanisms for even if we wanted to monitor and quote unquote enforce, you know, we don't really have the data system to do that. So instead, we choose to be more the guide on the side, the cheerleader, the critical friend to raise challenging questions, but also to support you in navigating those questions. So I guess the short answer to how is this enforced and who, this is enforced locally. And it's based on the professionalism that we all hold, and because it's the right thing to do. So again, I'll pass it back to Rel Midwest, and I again want to invite your ideas, comments, feedback, either email personally to me or through the chat.
Okay, thank you, Tyler, and thanks everybody for being with us in the webinar and asking all those great questions. We've recorded everything that's been in the chat box, and we'll certainly be sharing those records with MDE. I hope everybody will take a moment to please complete the survey. These feedback surveys are very important to us in continuing this work and in continuing to improve things like these webinars. If you have any questions, and I will say the survey link is also in the chat box as well as on screen, and we will try and follow up with attendees that were not able to stay. If I could have the next slide. If you have questions about the scan itself, please feel free to reach out to myself or Raquel or Jennifer. If you have questions about Rel Midwest, please reach out to me. And any questions or thoughts, comments about World's Best Workforce, of course, please reach out to Susan and Tyler. And thank you all so much for attending.